This is your spiritual game plan, and I am your host, Sherry Fletcher. Change, it happens to all of us. You've invested your time and energy into an important role, sometimes for years, and then suddenly it's time for you to move on. Maybe you've worked hard on a dream, and now your path is taking a new turn, but the dream isn't going with you. Perhaps you've raised your kids and they've moved on, but now your empty nest is filled with parent care. Or maybe you're in the middle of diaper changes and laundry piles. If you find yourself asking questions like, where do I fit in anymore? Am I even relevant? How do I find my purpose now? You are in the right place. This is a show for women in a season of transition. I believe that while your roles in life will change, your purpose is eternal. I'm here to help you understand just how intentionally you were made by a creator with a game plan. Through interviews and inspirational guests, we'll discover ways to help you unlock the purpose God placed in you, develop a game plan for your life calling, and embrace the intentional masterpiece you were created to be. Today, I will be speaking with Gonzalez. Karen is a speaker, writer, public theologian, and immigrant advocate. She herself immigrated from Guatemala as a child, and she will share what it's like to move to a new country, how Christians can help immigrants, and what the Bible really says about how immigrants should be treated. Immigration is a political hot topic, but Karen will help us take a fresh look at those around us and see them with God's eyes. There is an innate desire to belong and be seen for all of us. And God sees what you're going through today, and you will always find belonging in Him. Karen, I would love to welcome you to the show today. I am so excited to have you. Thank you for coming on. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. Just resting up, finishing a week of vacation.
Oh, no. Well, you're joining me on your vacation week.
Yes.
Thanks for doing that. That is so nice. Wow. I first heard your message when I listened to a podcast that you were interviewed on, and it's so powerful. So I am so glad that you are here to share your message with us today. I'd love it if you would tell us a little bit about you and your ministry.
Sure. So I would say more than anything, I am a writer, but I'm also a speaker, a public theologian, and primarily I speak about immigration because I am an immigration advocate and I'm an immigrant as well. I migrated from Guatemala when I was 9 years old. And I really began my career as a public school teacher. I was a high school English teacher for several years. And then I spent a couple of years overseas working in Christian service as an English teacher. And then when I returned, I sort of had a little bit of a spiritual crisis, I guess, while I was overseas. In that, I just began to see that the faith of the people I saw in the former Soviet Union was so different. And it provoked a real crisis in me of what does Jesus look like in different contexts? And it seemed like the faith I had been taught in the US didn't quite fit in other contexts. And so this led me to a sort of crisis that led me to seminary. And there I studied theology and missiology. And after that, I began work in the nonprofit Christian world. And I work for World Relief. And this is an organization that serves refugees and other immigrants. And through my work with World Relief and church engagement, I wrote a book about my own immigration story and also about the many immigrants that are found in the Bible. And really, this book was a labor of love because I just did not see enough immigrants writing down our own experiences of lived displacement. And so I felt this was a perspective that was important and needed. And so that's overall who I am. Aside from that, I can tell you that I live in Baltimore, Maryland. I have a very mean old cat. And I love baseball and cooking. I am so grateful that it's April and baseball is back. So That's me.
You are a baseball person?
I
Wow. I get bored real easy watching baseball. It doesn't move fast enough for me.
I like it though. I like the pace that you can sit next to someone, have a whole conversation, not miss a ton of what's happening. It's kind of like life. It's slow and then it's fast.
That's true. Okay, I'll have to look at it from that standpoint. My kids loved baseball. My son actually slept with his mitt when
Oh,
he was
that's so
little.
sweet.
So, yes. So, before we hit record, I was telling you I probably shouldn't ask you this question when I'm starving, but what is your favorite homemade meal from Guatemala?
Sure. So my favorite meal is called hilachas, and it's this kind of shredded beef that is it's cooked for a long time. My mom used to make it in the pressure cooker though, so it would come out really fast. But it's a shredded beef, and it's this chili sauce and potatoes that are a part of it, and it is so good. And I've never tasted it in anywhere else quite the way they make it in Guatemala. But having that with rice and beans is one of my favorite meals.
I can see you tasting it right now in your mind. For sure. I have one question that I ask every listener, and that is looking back in your life, how far back can you see the very purpose you are living out today in who you have always been?
I would say I can go back to when I was 9 years old and we had just moved to the US. Maybe we'd been living here about a year. And I just remember there was a girl that was on our bus. There were about 7 or 8 of us kids who lived in South Central LA, and we were bused all the way to a wealthy neighborhood called Encino in California. And it was this long bus ride. Well, in this little bus that we rode, I just remember everybody was really mean to this little girl named Carla. And I didn't even know her. We weren't friends. She was probably 2 grades below me. But I just remember thinking it's not fair that all of you should be so mean to her. She had this eye infection, and it caused her eye to close and swell a little bit. And this is why people were mean to her and were saying ew and didn't want to sit with her or be near her. And I just remember I stood up for her and I just said, it's not right. You don't have to like her, but you don't have to be mean. You don't have to act like she's gross or something. And it's the first time I saw that I can think back now that I saw in my life sort of this advocacy sort of action or activity in my life. The first time that I was like, this isn't right, and we shouldn't put up with it, and we shouldn't just let her be, um, let people be mean to her, So the bus driver had me sit with her because he witnessed this whole thing, and I sat with her because it wasn't right. And that was my first like advocacy that I remember in my life. So yeah, I think that's when I saw it. But I've always had that. I've always had a lot of like passion, and not just passion, but like this visceral sort of reaction to injustice and to seeing wrong done to people and wanting to fix it and address it, and make it right.
I love hearing that. I love hearing the different people's stories. And I love hearing that story and then the title of your book, The God Who Sees. And that, he placed that in you, that you are able to see injustice and see people through the lens of God. And so your book, The God Who Sees, Immigrants, the Bible, and the Journey to Belong, all of that is so powerful. And that's what we're going to be talking about. And so going to have you share parts of your immigration story, but there's also fascinating stories found in the Bible. And I believe that this topic is so divisive because we live in a divisive world. The enemy started the divisiveness when he, took a third of his angels with him down here and kept us divided. But I think it remains so divisive because we just don't talk about it enough. We don't hear the stories that you share in this book enough. And so, as long as we don't hear the stories and don't discuss it, it remains a divisive topic. So, I want to thank you for living out that purpose that God placed in you and to bring awareness of this immigration. So, I'd love to start at the source, and that is, what does the Bible say about immigration? A little bit of your story, and what are some of the misconceptions that we have about immigration?
Sure, that's a great question. And Sherry, the Bible says a lot about immigration. There are so many areas of life where people try to find guidance from the Bible, like, for example, dating and marriage. And the Bible says very little about these things because the ideas around these things were so different in the ancient world. But when it comes to immigration, there has always been movement of people, always, all the way from Genesis to the New Testament. Even Paul was an immigrant of sorts, making a living in different countries as a tent maker in order to share the gospel. And the first time that we meet Abraham, he's migrating. It says that God asked him to migrate to Egypt, and he went with his whole family. And so this is a story that's not unusual, or that's not, sometimes people have left me reviews on my book like, oh, I hate when people try to find, try to find the Bible to support their social issue that they care about. But this isn't true. The thing is, we haven't been taught to see the Bible through the stories of movement of people and migration, because we've always learned the Bible from the perspective of the dominant culture. And so when you're introduced to Abraham, you're taught that he is the father of the faith, and he is. He is also an immigrant. And not only is he an immigrant, but we know early on in his story that he traffics his wife, Sarah. He traffics her in order to preserve his own life. He does it out of fear. He doesn't do it because he doesn't care about her. He does it to preserve his own life. So not only is Abraham an immigrant, but he is a criminal and an immigrant. I mean, he does harm to Sarah to protect himself in a foreign land. And so, starting with Genesis, we see this message of how to treat the foreigner or the immigrant in our midst. Often in most translations of the Bible, it's called the stranger, right? The foreigner. And what we see is that as soon as the Israelites are delivered from Egypt, God tells them that they must love the immigrant as themselves, that they must do justice for the immigrant, because they were immigrants in Egypt. They were foreigners, and they know what it's like to be mistreated. And so this is repeated over and over again. Some 83 times in the Hebrew scriptures in the Old Testament, we read about God reminding them to do justice, to care for immigrants. And what this tells us is that immigrants were very likely people who were vulnerable to abuse, to exploitation, to injustice. We see, for example, what Joseph suffered in Egypt. He was sold by his brothers, he was enslaved, then he gets thrown in prison unjustly. And what happens? He's called that Hebrew, that Hebrew slave, that Hebrew prisoner. And so God provided very clear instructions and protections about how to care for immigrants. And the only place in the Bible where we really see them obeyed is in the book of Ruth. In the book of Ruth, you see the woman Ruth arriving in Bethlehem. Her mother-in-law is from Bethlehem, but Ruth isn't. And yet Boaz, who is a powerful person, treats Ruth justly. And we assume the rest of Bethlehem does as well. She is welcomed and she is loved like family. She is given a place gleaning the crops, which is a protection that God provided for people on the margins, not just her, but the poor, the widow, the orphan. They were allowed to walk into a field and start to work for their livelihood. Boaz tells his workers, don't assault her, don't insult her. So she's entitled not just to work, but to respect. She's allowed to sit at the table with Boaz and his workers. She drinks from their containers, even though her people were considered these, foreign, unclean Moabites. She drinks from the same container that they do. And we can assume she's also allowed to enter into Sabbath rest because God's command for Sabbath included the foreigner in the midst of the people of Israel. And so there is so much the Bible says about immigration. Honestly, once you have eyes to see it, it's hard to unsee it. It's hard to stop seeing it everywhere because you see so much of that. And so I really feel that because we've only been taught the Bible from one perspective instead of multiple perspectives. In other words, we don't hear immigrants teaching us the Bible. And so we don't hear these stories the way that they can also be read. So let me give you an example. I have a good friend, and a while ago we were doing a study on the book of Ruth, and my friend had really struggled with infertility. And she said, I love the book of Ruth. It always gives me so much hope because Ruth knew what it was like to deal with infertility. And I stopped and I was like, she did? How do you know? And she's like, well, she was married for 10 years and didn't have a child. And so in the ancient world, that was definitely infertility. And I told her that's really fascinating because when I read the story of Ruth, I read the story of an immigrant woman who is loved and is welcomed into this Bethlehem, right, into this city. And the thing is, both those stories are true. Both of them are found in the story of Ruth. And I think that's one of the most beautiful things about the Bible is the way that it's alive and that it speaks to us. But I think a lot of the misconceptions we have today about migration don't come from the Bible. They come from our society. They come from our own fears around scarcity. They come from our politicians and the rhetoric. They often want to scapegoat someone to be responsible for the problems in society. They come from a changing world where it used to be that you could not have a college degree and make a really good living. But the world and technology have changed, and often that's not a possibility anymore. And so immigrants are blamed for taking jobs. And so I think a lot of the misconceptions, if people are honest with themselves, they will admit and acknowledge that they don't come from the Bible. They come from society, from their family, from their peers. Sad to say, even sometimes from their churches. People have often taken Romans 13, for example, which says that we should obey the governing authorities because they've been placed there by God. Well, people have taken that verse and just applied it fully to immigration and saying, well, see, we don't have to care about this because these people are undocumented, right? They're unauthorized immigrants in our country. Okay, so even if that's the case, it's not telling you you can't love your neighbor, right? Let's say you followed that command to the letter. But also, what about Paul's life? What about the fact that Paul was ultimately executed by the Roman Empire? Paul is the one who wrote these words. Paul wrote much of the New Testament from prison. And why was that? Because every time the empire came into conflict with his faith, he chose his faith. He didn't choose the empire. And ultimately, he lost his life for that decision, which we would say is a very faithful decision as a follower of Christ. But people take his words out of the context of his life to support following the law of the land rather than following the laws and commands of God, which tell us to love our neighbors, particularly our neighbors in need. So that's kind of a long answer, but this is where
No,
This is what I'm seeing in the
I
Bible.
I love it. I love your passion. I hope people go on YouTube and watch this so they can see your passion and how much, this is such a great message. Um, I like you said, you in your book, you take immigration stories that are happening today, compare them to the stories in the Bible. I love how you see Ruth, how your friend saw Ruth. Both concepts I had not seen because they didn't relate to me. And one of the stories in the book that you wrote that you said was your favorite, and one that I found fascinating, was the Seraphinician woman. Um, and so, like you said, policies affect so many of the disfranchised communities in the United States and are not even considered important issues in our church. And one of the things you said earlier on was a fear of scarcity. And that really resonated with me because I think so many times we do get scared when we see so many people coming in. Like, how are we going to take care of them? What is that going to take from me? Um, and that makes me question my own faith. And when you were saying that, the story of Elijah going to that woman, the widow, and asking her to feed him first. He was a stranger, he was a foreigner in her land, and she wasn't noticed, or would not have been really a Christian because it was a pagan community, and yet she has nothing, and he says, feed me first, and she does, and God takes care of that, and he keeps her food coming. And I'm wondering how much, if we put our faith in God, no matter what our fear of scarcity is, how God could continue to bless and reward us when we take care of our brothers and sisters and our immigrant um, community. That really touched me. Thank you. Why is it, and how does God use? How did He use your story and this story of the Seraphinician woman to bring awareness to this issue?
Yes, well, I have to confess the Seraphinician Woman was one of those stories that I was always really weary of, and I didn't want to touch it because it made me really uncomfortable. It seemed like Jesus was being needlessly cruel to this woman. He calls her a dog, if you remember. He says, she asks for healing for her daughter, and he responds by saying, I came here for the children. It's not right to give the dogs the food meant for the children. And the woman responds, well, even the dogs get the crumbs under the table. And Jesus affirms her for her words and grants her request. And I was always so uncomfortable with that Jesus in that story. And I really struggled. But I noticed a few things that were really critical in the story. And one is he has entered her land and he's gone there to get away, to get rest. And she's the one who has invaded his privacy. She has entered. She is desperate for healing for her child, and she won't be denied an audience with this rabbi who can perform miracles and save her child. And so, even though she's a woman and she's foreign and she's considered unclean, contaminated, right? She decides she will speak to him anyway. And in fact, he grants her request. And I thought of the way this woman spoke up for her child, the way she became an advocate really for all people who are denied inclusion, who are denied belonging. She just says, hey, look, even the dogs deserve something. She's willing to lower herself, right, to sass back to Jesus by conceding what he has called her and saying, yeah, but we need food too. And he sees that. It touches something in Jesus. And we don't know what's actually happening in the story. We don't know if Jesus is play acting for his disciples so that they learn something from this encounter. We don't know if it's one of Jesus's human moments where his compassion needs to be activated by someone. We just don't know what's happening. But we do know he grants her request and that it matters to him that this woman came before him. It matters to him that this woman um, asked for this healing and he gave it to her. He granted it to her, even though she was a Gentile, even though she had all this, sort of multi layered exclusion from his community. And I think I learned so much about belonging because the question of immigration is so much about belonging. You know, the Bible says that the whole earth is the Lord's and everything in it, but we really don't live that way. We live as if, this is my land, that is your land, you live over there. That's the way that we treat land. We don't treat it as belonging to God's and sort of being on loan to us, and being good stewards of this thing that is not ours, that actually belongs to God. But Jesus transcends all these cultures, all these borders. He doesn't respect them in the way that we do in the world. And ultimately, the question of immigration has to do with belonging, who belongs rightfully in a place or not. And so I love that this woman becomes an advocate and says, no, I want to belong too. And Jesus says, you know what? You do. Your words have healed your daughter. That faith that you showed through these words have made your daughter well. And I like to imagine how this woman was changed by this encounter with Jesus. Um, Imagine, being so marginalized and having this rabbi not only listen to you, but affirm you and grant you exactly what you asked of him.
Yeah, and how it's still changing today in what we do. In the book, you take a modern story of Alejandra and how this correlated. I'd love for you to share a little bit about your experience with Alejandra.
Yes. So I want to clarify. Alejandra is actually like a composite story,
Okay.
um, just because I wanted to protect the privacy of all these legal cases.
Right.
But I encountered women like Alejandra regularly working there. And this was a woman who lived in her own country. And that's one of the points I try to make in the book is people are not sitting around in their countries in Guatemala or India or China or the Philippines thinking about the American dream. All of us would rather stay in our own countries because that's our place of comfort, our language, our family, our culture, everything is there. But what drives people to migrate is usually need for jobs, for resources, need for safety. And so this was Alejandra's story as well. She did not have any dreams of migrating, but what happened to her is that these gangs that moved into her neighborhood, and I'm sure you've heard of these gangs like MS-13 that are really prevalent in the northern triangle of Central America, which is Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. They moved into her neighborhood and started terrorizing her. And they commit often what is called a power rape, in that they often threaten women with, I will hurt your whole family. I have the power to harm everyone, in your household if you don't become my girlfriend, if you don't sleep with me. And so this is what happened to her. And she became pregnant as a result of these rapes. And she ended up having the child, and things went back to a sort of semi-normal pace, in her life until the gang members started terrorizing her again. And when I say gangs, I think people imagine sort of roving teenagers, but these are sophisticated criminal enterprises. These are more like mafias than like gangs. They own police officers, they extort from businesses. It's a really scary problem that has overtaken it. It's overwhelmed the authorities in these countries of knowing how to manage. Police are so afraid of these gangs that even when they make arrests, they wear head covering so they're not recognized because they're afraid for their own safety and their families. That's how bad it is. And so this gang member threatened to take away her child, the father of this child, and she became really afraid. And so her parents borrowed $7,000 and they hired a human smuggler. It's called a coyote, and he brought her all the way to the US, and she eventually made her way to Maryland where she had family, friends. And here she was seeking asylum, which is the most difficult immigration solution to get, in my opinion. I mean, they say that less than 10% of people who apply for asylum are granted asylum. And during the Trump administration, it was more like 4% of people. So applying for asylum is no guarantee that people will get asylum, but it is their right to apply under our laws. And what becomes really hard for women like Alejandra is that you have to prove, you have to prove your case to the authorities, which means telling your story over and over again to legal representatives, to judges. And our office doesn't even handle asylum cases because they require a lot of resources and they often take years to put together. So we referred her to an agency that works specifically with women who had experienced sexual violence. But it is, to me, what was most disheartening is that, the Seraphinician woman talked back to Jesus, and Jesus, who was a good and just man, right? He's a man, but he's also God, listens and affirms her and grants her request. Well, Alejandra tried to stand up to her, this man that was oppressing her as well, and she was almost crushed by this man. I mean, he threatened the lives of her sister and her family. It's brutal, and it's a horrible injustice that's not being addressed in the world. And so to me, her story reminded me so much of the Seraphinician woman and what happens when we encounter injustice and we use our voices, right? Um, she used her voice and almost lost her life and maybe even her family's, but the Seraphinician woman used her voice, and Jesus granted her this request. And of course, I think the message is really clear to all of us. The outcome is really not our business. We can't control that. We can't control how other people will act, right? But using our voice and advocating and speaking up, this is critical, not because it guarantees us any kind of success, but because it guarantees us a sane life, an honest life before God. And so that's what really moved me about her story when I sort of put it in conversation with the story of the Seraphinician woman.
That is so powerful. And it's just things you don't think about because they aren't a part of your everyday life. Um, so, speaking of immigration and jurisdiction and all of that, how do we uphold the law and still take care of our immigrant neighbors?
It's a great question. And the best way that I can answer that is we did uphold the law for many decades. I think that there's an assumption that our border situation has always been the way it is, but that's actually not true. In fact, our border didn't start becoming militarized and walls didn't start being built until the 1970s. That's when everything changed. And it changed as a result of politics and some different things that happened after the Vietnam War. But that's what led to this big change. Before that, we had lots of work visas for things like agriculture, things like slaughterhouses and working in poultry plants and all these places. And people got these visas and they went just back and forth. They would come into the US to work for the agricultural season and then return back to Mexico or Central America or wherever they came from. They were not interested in staying in the US long term. Then what happened is the walls came up and the border became militarized and there was an investment made in border patrol. And then what happened is that crime grew. It's very counterintuitive. You know, the way that Sabbath practice is counterintuitive. God tells us to practice Sabbath. And in fact, if we rest one day a week, we are actually more productive the other 6 days. That's God's economy. It's counterintuitive, but it works. It's the same thing with the border. People think militarized borders make us safer, and they actually don't. What they do is they increase criminality. They increase the trafficking of people, the trafficking of drugs, the trafficking of goods. It increases violence because now people are have to pay to be brought across the border. It increases deaths because the walls are usually in urban areas, right? And what it means is that people are pushed out way into deserts to cross, and now there's a threat of dying of dehydration or being abandoned in the desert by a dishonest smuggler. So, and this is in fact what happens to many, many people. So, when I say that as followers of Jesus, we're called to trust in our God and what God says about our care for our neighbors, we're not called to trust in walls, in rubber bullets, in border patrols. We're not called to trust in any of that. And so I want to encourage people to really study the past and the way that the border used to be, especially in the 70s, but also to look at um, what does God say about walls? What does God say about harming the world's poorest people? These are the people that are coming. Are there drug traffickers in Mexico? Yes, we know of drug cartels that existed in Mexico, that exist in Colombia, and all these different places. We know that that's true. Is that the immigrants that are coming? No, the majority are poor people that are seeking jobs. And you know what the reality is? Again, counterintuitive, but we have more jobs than we do citizens. Now, people who are unemployed might say, well, that's not true, and not in my field. But in fact, we have more jobs in agriculture. Here in Baltimore, where I live, immigrants, we have all these Johns Hopkins hospitals all over the place. Immigrants work in industrial laundries, washing hospital linens. There's tons of jobs there. There's tons of jobs in the Amazon warehouse, tons of jobs in poultry factories and meat packing. There's tons of jobs. Our citizens don't want to work in apple orchards. People want to do apple picking for fun. They don't want to do it as a job. And so that we have many more jobs, especially what I would say is unskilled labor, but also at highly skilled levels, software engineers, doctors in certain specialties. So we have many more jobs than we do citizens to perform them. Part of the reason for that is also because we have an aging population of baby boomers who are about to retire. And so it seems counterintuitive, I know, but we're called to trust in God's economy, not in the world's economy. And in fact, there are enough resources for all of us. This is why people have always migrated to have access to resources. And what's unnatural is blocking people from accessing these things. So I know it's hard, and I'm not saying that it's an easy thing by any means, but we have historical precedent for it. We also have a biblical message and command from God to care for our neighbors in need. So,
Yeah, that is very good. I like one of the points that you made that I really want to make clear is that a lot of these people aren't coming over here because they want to live the American dream. And if we could stop and really put ourselves in the shoes, like you said, of the person that is fleeing, like your story of Alejandra, she is fleeing, but she's leaving her family. Immigration is a story of loss. And if someone is someone listening themselves today is an immigrant and has lost a role or a position that they had. I know that I've met people that were highly educated in their country, and when they came here, they weren't allowed to uh, even do the job that they had been educated to do. So they lost a part of what would seem their identity. What do you say to the immigrant that is over here about their purpose in God's plan?
That's a great question, Sherry. And I think what I would say to them is that their identity is that they are image bearers of God. And the work that they do, what they produce, is not a part of their identity. That is not who they are. That is work that they're doing to survive and to provide for their families. And I would say to them too that they belong. They have a right to, we have in the scriptures the story of a woman, Rahab. And this is a woman who was a sex worker. And yet, even so, God welcomes her, even though she's a foreigner, a Canaanite, right? And a sex worker. God welcomes her into the family. God intends to be the God of all people, right? And she doesn't give up this profession before she's welcomed. In fact, all she does is believe in God, and she helps these spies, right, that are scouting the land. Um, and that's what I would say to immigrants as well, too, is you don't have to be good or perfect to belong. That God is not requiring that of you. That you are allowed to have bad days. You are allowed to lose your temper sometimes and to become frustrated. You are allowed to not study English as hard as you would because you're tired from long days of work. You are allowed all of these things and you still belong. You are still a child of God. You are still made in the image of God. And God says that you belong, no matter what other people might say to you.
That is beautiful. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your vacation to join me, to not only bless me, but our listeners, and to give us just a small, I'm talking a small glimpse into the education that's out there that needs to be studied and looked into. And so I am hoping that anyone listening will take the time to not only purchase your book and learn more, but get to know what's going on in your community, get to know the immigration needs that you could help with in your community. So I just want to thank you for taking the time to come on and join me.
Thanks so much, Sherry. It's been great to be here with you as well. It's always so heartening and so hopeful for me when people are interested in learning more about immigration.
Thank you. I hope this time with Karen ignited a desire in you to learn more about what the Bible says about the foreigners in our land and encourages you to see your neighbor as God sees them. If you are an immigrant, it is my prayer that Karen's message will give you comfort knowing that you are seen and that you belong. You have a purpose in God's plan. In the show notes, you will find links to connect with Karen and purchase her book. Have you subscribed to this podcast? If not, please do so. That way you do not miss any up and coming episodes, and I value your feedback. Here's a review I just received. I so appreciate Sherry's approach and message. This is a solid reminder that God has gifted us all in unique ways that correspond with His plan for our lives. These conversations are edifying and thoroughly enjoyable. I so appreciate these kinds of feedback because they let me know if I am reaching you and serving you in the best possible way. When you leave a rating and a review, it helps to get the word out about the podcast. It also lets me know how I can continue to serve you. During today's episode, did a friend come to mind who you know would be blessed? If so, I would love it if you'd share a link with them. Listeners like you sharing links with others is how this podcast can reach more people. I'd love to have you join my mailing list. I send out a weekly update with more of a personal touch and information about new episodes before they come out. Thank you so much for tuning into Your Spiritual Game Plan, the podcast that helps you understand that God has a plan and you have a purpose in it.